Okay, Romans the 13th chapter today. Now, as we start on Romans 13, we can see here it's God's teaching about the Christian and civil government. So if you wanted to go to a place to see what your responsibility is toward civil government, this would be the place to go. Now, first of all, as we start out today, I'll raise this question. Thank you, Ron. We just got through studying the 12th chapter, and we studied all of those things. I don't know how many things there were, 20 things, I guess. Specific things that Paul said, here's what I want you to do as a Christian. So now then we come down, and here in chapter 13, all of a sudden he starts talking about civil government. And we think about chapter 13 as that way. In other words, it's a chapter that deals with civil government. But we'd say that's rather strange, that Paul is going along and telling us how to conduct ourselves as a Christian, and then all of a sudden he jumps off into what civil government is supposed to be. And so you have a study in that. But in reality, it all fits together. Now, as we start today, I want to call your attention to the fact that there are three great institutions created by God. In the very beginning, God created the family. He put the family on this earth for a particular reason. And we'll not go into those reasons. You know them as well as I do. But families are composed to do a certain function so this world can operate in the way that it should. Then God gave us the church or the kingdom. Now, there is a particular purpose for the kingdom or the church, and we should not get them mixed up. The family's for one purpose, the church is for another purpose, and each one of them has its own unique purpose upon this earth. Now, the third thing, institution or organization that God gave us is the government. Now, He gave us a government, and every nation has a government over it. And we're going to learn that God placed the government over these particular nations. Now, He's going to tell us what we're to do as a government. But I want you to start out, and I want you to notice here in Romans 13th chapter, in verses 3 and 4, just one point, and then we'll go back over it again. It said, "For rulers are not a terror to the good work, but to the evil. For he is a minister of God." Now, I might stop right here and say that as we're going down through here, when it uses this word he in some of your translations and it in other translations, really it's talking about the civil government. Now, the reason for that is this, that in the Greek, the word for he, she, and it is all the same. You can't tell the difference between them. In other words, it would be like if in English, let's suppose we didn't have a word for he or she or it, we just had a word that functioned for all three of them. And so if you're talking about a woman, then you'd say, now I was talking to this woman yesterday, and let's say it, and it told me, I was referring back to the female woman. But if I'm talking to a man, then I'd say, and it told me, I was talking to the man. But if I said, I threw a rock yesterday, and it hit a window, I'm talking about the rock. In other words, all three of those words in the Greek language are exactly the same. So when you read this, it says, and he is a terror, I don't want you to think about an individual. What he's talking about is the civil government, as we will see as we go back through it. But that's not the point that I really want to make. I just wanted to clarify that. And here's a statement. It says, he or it is a minister of God. So civil government is a minister of God. Civil government is a servant of God. Then you skip on down to the next I have down there in yellow, and he is a minister of God. Now in this verse, it plainly says 2 times that civil government is a minister of God. So as we see, God, of course, created Adam and Eve, and He put the family in function in this earth. He also created the kingdom or the church. Christ came and He died for that. It has a purpose. But God also has a purpose for civil government. So that's the first thing that I want us to see as we start out today. We're talking about civil government as a minister or a creation of God. Now, there are other places in the Bible that teach about this very, very clearly. In Daniel chapter 4 is a passage that we ought to always remember. Here we have Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is the ruler of the world. And Nebuchadnezzar has gone over and captured Judah, and he brought over Daniel as a captive. And so Daniel now is there as a minister or servant for King Nebuchadnezzar. Now Daniel has taught King Nebuchadnezzar that you really don't have this office on your own. That the only reason you have this office is because God put you here. God put you here as a ruler of the world. And then he told him, back in chapter 2, he said, now some of these days God's going to remove you, and He's going to put in another ruler. And then God's going to remove that ruler, and He'll put in another one. Then He's going to remove that ruler, and He'll put in another one. Now, when He puts in that fourth government, then God is going to do certain things like set up His own kingdom. But now, this was rather shocking to King Nebuchadnezzar, and King Nebuchadnezzar had a problem with it. It's kind of interesting. He, of course, didn't believe in Jehovah God, and here it is, he has Daniel telling him, you have been given this office, this government. God is having Babylon to rule the world, and it's God that does it, it's not you. So the story goes on, and one day King Nebuchadnezzar was bothered about this. And he was out on the porch and he was walking back and forth. And it tells in the book of Daniel how he was meditating. And he says, now, didn't I conquer all of these nations? Didn't I, Nebuchadnezzar, didn't I put my army together? Didn't I conquer them? And didn't I build all of this great city of Babylon? Did not I draw up the plans? Didn't I do it? And King Nebuchadnezzar is wrestling with this problem because Daniel said God did it. And King Nebuchadnezzar says, it doesn't make sense because I know I did it. Well, it is at that time that God sent Nebuchadnezzar a message. And he sent it and through Daniel again, and here's the message to King Nebuchadnezzar. He said, the kingdom is departed from you. God's going to take the kingdom away from you. Now here's the ruler of the world. And thou shalt be driven from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and thou shalt be made to eat grass as oxen. And 7 era or 7 times shall pass over thee. We don't know how long those times were. It's generally thought that they were probably years, 7 years. Now, he said, King Nebuchadnezzar, here's what's going to happen to you. All of a sudden, you're going to lose your mind. And your mind is going to be turned into the mind of an oxen. So that you go out in the field and you're going to eat grass for these 7-year period of time. And you're going to eat that grass until you come to realize one thing. You're going to stay there until you learn one lesson. And here's the lesson. It says here, it says, and 7 times shall pass over thee until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men and giveth it to whomsoever he will. So he said, King Nebuchadnezzar, you're going to be taught that lesson. Well, it happened. Just like that, King Nebuchadnezzar's mind went, whatever you want to call it. He goes out in the field, and he crawls around out there and he eats grass with the cows. And while he's eating grass with the cows, finally, in this 7-year period of time, he came to a startling conclusion. And that is that God meant what God said. God has done to me what he said he would do. And King Nebuchadnezzar came to his senses, and he says, now I know that God does rule the kingdom of men. Then is when God returned him back to normal, restored him back on his throne. But here's a lesson. And the lesson is that King Nebuchadnezzar had to learn, most powerful man in the world, that the Most High, God, rules in the kingdom of men and giveth it to whomsoever he will. So we learned there, God does control governments. Now in Titus 3:1, Paul says, put them in mind to be in subjection to rulers, to authorities, to be obedient, to be ready unto every good work. So here now he says is an instruction I want you to give to the Christians. And that is, put them in mind to be in subjection to rulers and authorities. So now it's becoming a pretty important thing. Christianity is not only doing those 20-some things we learned in chapter 12, but it's also being in subjection to civil government. Peter one time said, be subject to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme, or unto governors as sent by him for vengeance on evildoers, and for praise them that do well. So, Peter again instructs the Christians to be in subjection to every ordinance, every law of man, whether it's the king's law, national law, or whether it's of governors, state law, be in subjection to them. Now, I want you to notice a couple other things there, because when we get back to Romans again, it's going to be brought out one more time. Peter here tells why God sets up these rulers, why he has national rulers and state rulers. And he says, now, they're sent by him, they're sent by God for vengeance on evildoers. God has set them to take vengeance on evildoers, to control evil people, and to praise them that do well. So that's God's purpose for government. Then Paul tells us what our responsibility is. He said, I exhort you, therefore, first of all, that supplications and prayers and intercessions, these are different kind of prayers, thanksgiving be made for all men, for kings, and all that are in high places. So I said, now, as Christians, I want you to pray for your leaders. I want you to pray for your kings. I want you to pray for everybody who are in high places in government. And pray so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and gravity. So pray for them, that whatever else they might do, they might lead us in such a way that we can live in peace on this earth. So Peter says, your responsibility now is to pray. So now then, let's start putting it together and see what this is all about. In chapter 12, we closed last week in showing that Paul, over and over again, says, don't you take vengeance. Now we identified that word and gave the meaning of that word, and what it means is, don't you take it on your own self to see that justice is dispensed. When somebody does an evil thing to you, don't you turn around and say, now you're going to pay for that. Now, as little kids, we learned that. We just grew up with a sense of justice. Somebody hit me, I turn around and hit them, and I'm paying you back. And then we generally say, and I'm going to pay you back twice. And so we do that. I'm going to teach you a lesson. And we think we're justified. So what this means is, don't you pay back people. When somebody does something evil to you, don't you pay them back. Don't you act in the same way. Don't you take it upon yourself to bring about justice. That word for vengeance is justice. So don't take it upon yourself. Now that's what he told us in chapter 12. Don't do that. God says, justice or vengeance belongeth unto me, saith the Lord. So God says, I'll take care of the justice. Don't you do it. Now, in chapter 13, God is going to tell us how he does it. How does God take care of this justice? Well, first of all, we would know that if somebody is evil on this earth, that they will receive their due justice. That at the judgment day, God will see that justice is rendered out to them. But that's not what this is talking about. This is talking about justice upon this earth. God says, don't you try to make men pay them back. You leave that to me. God says, that's my job. Now, chapter 13 tells us how God does it on this earth. God says, I set up civil government for this very purpose. Now, obviously, the 13th chapter immediately follows the 12th chapter, and look at this. Here's how it closed out. In Romans, the 12th chapter, that last week, why it says, avenge not yourself, beloved. Then he comes down and he said, vengeance belongeth unto me. That's how we closed out chapter 12. Now, in chapter 13, we start out, and notice this. He's going to say here that God did this, and then down here in red, for he, or it, the government, is a minister of God, an avenger for wrath to him that doeth evil. Now that word avenger is the same word for vengeance that we have up there in chapter 12. That this civil government will see that justice is done. So what we have then is we have God back in the Garden of Eden set up the family. He set up the family for procreation, to raise children, to replenish the earth, and so forth and so on in that family relationship. He sent Christ to die on the cross to set up his church or his kingdom for the salvation of man. Now then, he has set up civil government so that civil government's purpose is to take vengeance on evil doers. That's the purpose of it. Now, when you're driving down the street today and you drive down there and you might just be cruising along and nothing happening, but all of a sudden you see behind you a car with red lights flashing. What do you think? You think there might be a trouble, see? And so you look down, I'm going the speed limit, I'm doing this or that, but it shakes you up, doesn't it? Nobody gets the idea, I never have turned to hell. Oh, honey, we got a guy who wants us to stop. I bet he wants to give us some money. See? We don't have that. When you see a policeman, you know he's out there to control evildoers. That's the purpose. If you take evildoers out of the world, then we wouldn't need any police force whatsoever. So, as we start out now with civil government in Romans the 13th chapter, we're going to start out and we will identify these words, and that's what the next chart will be about. As we go along, we'll just be giving the definition of these words. All right, he says, let every soul be in subjection to the higher powers. Now, subjection means to arrange under, to subordinate, to obey. That's what the word really means. It's a military word. Austin back there is getting ready to join the army. Now, when he goes in, this word's going to be very meaningful to him. He's going to be in subjection. He's going to be placed under. He'll be placed under a certain authority. And when that authority speaks, he's to do that. And subjection is an army term that's like this. And so now we have subjection in various other terms, but that's the basic meaning. It means to be placed under. So we're to be subordinate to. We're to obey. We're to obey our civil government. So let every soul, it's every one of us, be in subjection to the higher powers. The word for powers there is literally authorities. Let us be in higher authorities. Now, in your Bible, when you see the word power can mean one of two things. It can either mean that you have the power, like a caterpillar has the power to pull a car out of a ditch. Now, that's one kind of power. That's inherent power. That's the word really for dynamite. It has that power, that strength. Then there's another word for power, and that's a word that means authority. You might take somebody who is a president of the United States. Let's take President Roosevelt. He was a disabled person in a wheelchair all of his life. He couldn't have pulled a wagon, a little red wagon, across the yard. He couldn't walk. But yet he was full of power. And that means he was full of authority. That when he spoke, he had this authority to move a nation. That's what this word is. The word here, so be in subjection now to all the higher authorities, for there is no authority but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God. So he makes it very clear to us. All governments are set up of God. All governments are ordained. The word ordained means set in place. All governments are set in place by God. Now, therefore, he that withstandeth the power withstandeth the ordinance of God, and they that withstand shall receive to themselves judgment. So now then, here we have, they then that withstand that power, withstand that ordinance that has been put in, the laws that has been arranged in there then, is withstanding what God really would have us to do. Now, that word withstand or resist really means to take a stand against. It's not talking about you driving down the road and you're going 65 in a 60-mile speed zone, and you look down, oops, I'm over the speed limit. You've disobeyed, but you haven't resisted. Resist means, the word means stand against. It means you take a stand against. So now, don't take a stand against the civil government, is what he's saying. Don't resist him in that sense. Now, when you do, he said, then I want you to understand, you're not just resisting the civil government, but you are withstanding the ordinance of God. So you look and you say, those lousy cops, no good, low-down governor, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do that, I'll do as I please. I'm smarter than they are. They're a bunch of liars, cheats. Well, can't argue with that. Probably are, you see. But God is using them. He's put them in place. And when we disobey, we're disobeying not a bunch of liars and cheats. We're disobeying the ordinance of God. So we have to keep that in mind. All of a sudden, it becomes a very, very serious thing. By the way, how many people do you know of, how many people have you ever read about in history that lived under a government that they just dearly loved and that they didn't have complaints about? The taxes weren't too high. They weren't abused in any way. They had the freedoms and nothing taken away from them. There were no abuses, nothing of this nature. See, it just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. Every government has its faults. But let's stop to think now for just a minute on this. Let's take a family. Are there families that never have ever made a mistake? A dad and a mom raised their children but never made a mistake? Never happened, was there? Never happened. But what does God say to do? What did God tell the children to do? Obey your aunts and uncles. Is that what he said? No. obey your parents. See? Obey your parents. Now, when you obey your parents, regardless of how evil and bad they are, they might be drunkards and so forth, but they have their children's good at heart. And they give you good advice. And you can say, well, I know of somebody who was it, Maul Barker or something like that, a criminal that taught her boys how to rob banks and all of this. Yeah, but those are the exceptions of the case. That's the reason she gets on television, is because she's so far out. But God set it up, and there are families. If you'll do what God tells you to do in a family, you're going to be happy. In the church, are there any bad decisions made by churches? Any churches go awry? Yeah. Well, same way with civil government. Civil governments make mistakes. Kings make mistakes. Policemen make mistakes. They do all of this. But most of the time, they're right. Now, let's stop to think, what would happen if you didn't have a civil government? Let's take it away. First of all, maybe we ought to go back to mom and dad. Since some moms and dads are rotten, let's do away with moms and dads. Let's just do away with the family. What would this world be like if there were no moms and dads? Oh, there are a lot of children, but there were no parents. You'd say, well, the world would be in chaos. Yeah, that's true. What would happen if there was no kingdom? There was no church, because people make mistakes in churches. Well, there would be no salvation. What would happen if there was no government? Have you ever read any stories or books about what would happen, and you begin to look at it if there is no government? About the best illustration I can think of that I've ever seen in my life was, you remember when we went over and removed Saddam Hussein, and tore down that statue? And then Bush did away with the standing army, did that away, and so we're going now to set this thing in order. So there was a period of time when there was no army, there was nothing over Iraq. You remember that period of time? What happened on the first day? On the first day, the government buildings were looted. They went into museums, and they took the artifacts out of museums that's over there, the oldest country in the world with the oldest artifacts in the world. They stole them. They tore up the building. They were just running amok. And could the Iraqis go out on the street to that? No. So they couldn't go out on the street. They'd be shot. They'd be robbed. You can't even start to think about how bad a nation would be if it didn't have civil government and didn't have police and so forth to control it. So God's government, that's what God put them in there for. He put them in, and our job is to obey them. Now quickly, are there ever any commands that a parent gives to a child that the child should say, no, Dad, Mom, I'm not going to do that? Would there ever be a time, God says, obey your parents. Would there ever be a time when you would recommend to a 12-year-old boy, no, don't do that? He said, but my dad says you're going to do it. No, don't obey your dad. Would there ever be a time that you would do that? There would be a time, wouldn't there? Let's go back to Maul Barker. When she's taking her little boys and teaching them how to rob banks, if they had come to you and told you what's going on in the home, what would you have told them? You'd have told them not to do it, wouldn't you? And they said, Mom says to do it. Well, no. Now then, Mom's law comes in conflict with God's law. And no, don't you do it. What would happen in the church today if Steve there, one of the elders, he gets up and he says, now, starting today, we're going to, and he comes up with some far-fetched rule that he's going to put in place that you can kill one person a year. what would you say? Oh, no, Steve. No way. You see. No, you're not going to do this. Now, are there ever a time when you're to disobey civil government? There is an example in the Bible. Where is it? You remember what it's all about? It's Peter back in Acts. You remember the Sanhedrin called Peter and John in and told them, don't you ever speak in the name of Jesus again. Now we're going to turn you loose. You're free. And your only requirement is, don't you ever preach about Jesus again. What did Peter tell him? He said, should we obey God or man? There it is. They had to come back again and reaffirm that. But he's telling them, now you have now come down and you are making us make a decision. Shall we obey you, man-made law, which God says to obey, or are we to obey God? When they come in conflict, then you're not to do that. When parents give a command to a child that is in conflict with the laws of God, no, don't do it. When elders in the church make rules that's in conflict with the law of God, nope, don't do it. When civil government makes a law in conflict with the law of God, suppose that they would, in this chaotic condition we're in today, that the civil government says, we're going to put a stop to all this religious confusion and this Muslim problems. And so starting next year, January 1st, there will be no more public worshiping hours. No more churches worshiping publicly. We're going to give you a year, get rid of your buildings, do whatever you want to do, but as of January 1st, no more worship. What would you do? There'd be a problem, wouldn't it? Surely if you came here and you worshiped, they're going to come in and arrest all of you and take the building and so forth. So, yeah. But what are you going to do? Now, what's the one thing that you're not even going to consider? What would be the one thing? That not to worship, quitting worship. We are going to worship. Now, we'll probably have to go underground. We may have to start doing it in our homes or in the basement. But here's what God says, and here's what we are going to do. And so the Bible deals with all of those things. But overall, in Romans the 13th chapter, here's where we are down here, that he's telling us that we are to be obedient unto God, and God has set up governments, and therefore we're to be obedient to governments. Now there's where we'll stop today. Next week then, we'll go ahead and we'll finish this out then in the various things that we're to do with civil government.